At the end of the government's first week of Brexit negotiations, AHDB are hosting 3 debates with a panel of experts. In this, the second Brexit360 special, we will try and answer your questions about what the big issues are. Since the referendum, AHDB has focused efforts delving into the detail with its Horizon series of reports, providing vital insight to the industry at this time of uncertainty. Later, a panel of experts looks at what we need to do next as a post-Brexit world looms ever nearer. For now, though, while the specifics for individual farmers will vary depending on sector, size and even location, some common themes have emerged for the agri-food sector, and we'll hear from farmers on their key concerns as they look ahead to a post-Brexit world. And our expert panel will give their view on the trade, labour and farm policy issues that dominate discussions. If you're watching us live, you can send us your questions. Direct message us at the AHDB or via hashtag AskAHDB. So what are the big issues? To help answer that question and others, I'm joined by a panel of experts. Just before I introduce them, let's hear some of your comments and comments from fellow farmers.
No one really knew what was going to happen. The politicians couldn't tell us the benefits of coming out or the benefits of staying in, really. But some people try and compare us with other countries, like the On Country for Other try and compare us with New Zealand. They haven't got any subsidies at all. Fine, it's a totally different climate out there. You can't really compare us with them, can you? We're in our own unique situation over here. We're an island. That should be an advantage to us, really. You know, we haven't got borders with other European countries. We have got our border is the sea. So surely that's got to help us. We are an efficient crop production country in the world. Very efficient, really. Even though our costs are high. But I'm sure everybody's going to still want to trade with us. They're not just going to cut us off like that.
I was very keen to be able to farm without subsidies, but I was a Remain voter because I felt there was no plan to get from where we are currently with subsidies through to farming without subsidies. And I think for farmers to successfully do that, we need a plan, we need a bit of support. But we're leaving and we're accelerating the process to farming outside of Europe. A year on from the referendum, I don't feel that any party has really addressed agriculture. I don't think anybody's really formed a plan as to how agriculture is going to be handled in the Brexit negotiations. I can see there being a lot more of an environmental focus to any money that comes across, but I do worry about the trade negotiations, because if we're losing Europe, we lose the protection from lower assurance standards products coming into this country, whether it be beef with hormones, chicken removed by chlorine. There's a whole raft of lower welfare standards that we'll be competing against without the protection of the European Union.
You know, we make decisions that are 3 or 4 year long decisions, and we need to have a plan in mind when we make business decisions going forward. So the sooner we see clarity within negotiations, the better.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts. Phil Bicknell, the AHDB Market Intelligence Director. Phil joined the organisation in 2017 in January, and he heads up a team of 60 people looking after market and data specialists, providing high-quality, independent analysis and insight. Phil was the NFU's head of food and farming and formerly their chief economist. Growing up on a family livestock farm, Phil is an agricultural economics graduate from the University of Reading. Graham Redman is a partner with the Anderson Centre. Graham is an agricultural business advisor, and his work covers a wide range of research for the agri-industry and food supply chain sectors. His specialisms include global grain economics and agricultural competitiveness. Tom Keane, EU Exit and International Trade Advisor with the NFU. Tom took up his post in the NFU's newly formed EU Exit and International Trade team in June this year. The team coordinates, develops and promotes NFU policy concerning Brexit and trade, bringing together expertise to make the case to government for the best deal possible for agriculture post-Brexit. Tom grew up on his family's dairy farm and has been with the NFU since September 2014. In the last couple of years, Tom has spent time working and lobbying on the European policy in the NFU Brussels office. I'm John Bates. Welcome to Brexit360. So I think we'd all agree that farming matters. Thank you very much for joining the panel today. Phil, perhaps if I could come to you first, and if you could just give me a quick sort of overview of what you see as the big issues.
I suppose for me the big issues fall into four key areas. The first one is around farming policy. For over 40 years, the Common Agricultural Policy has set the framework for how UK farmers operate. Outside of Europe, what is farming policy, what is agricultural policy going to look like? Second area is trade, our trading relationship with the EU, but also the rest of the world. We have an opportunity, I think, when it comes to resetting some of those relationships, particularly trade deals outside the EU, but I'm conscious that 3/4 of the food that we export currently goes to Europe. It's a key trading partner, so trade is that second area. A third aspect is labour, and I'm conscious labour's been in the news quite a lot this week, particularly around seasonal workers. However, labour availability or access of labour from elsewhere in Europe is pretty, it's not just about seasonal workers, it's more widely in our food processing sector and the agri-food supply chain. So I think that's a challenge. Then the fourth one, the final one, I think, is around regulation. Europe and various rules and regulations, again, set some of the parameters and the foundation for the legislative framework in which UK farmers operate. So outside of Europe, what scope does that give us in terms of addressing some of the legislation challenges, but also what does it start to look like? So those are the kind of four key areas for me, John.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. Graham, clearly from an Anderson's point of view, you've been out and about with your colleagues, talking to farmers and so on. What are the big issues that you're seeing?
Well, the big things for the time being is that we need to remember that, okay, for the last 12 months, we're still a member of the European Union. Nothing has fundamentally changed. Yes, the pound has weakened substantially, which has given the industry a boost, a benefit for the majority of farmers in terms of output prices. But more than anything else, whether we're in the European Union or out of the European Union, the biggest thing which affects the profitability of that individual farm is the performance of that individual, the farm manager, him or herself. And so carry on managing as before and doing a good job on that farm business.
Thank you. And Tom, from an NFU point of view, how do you see the world?
Well, actually, that sort of Phil has jumped the gun there a bit. I mean, that's exactly the four areas that we're seeing Brexit360, so domestic policy, trade, regulation and labour availability. I'd also sort of like to reflect, I think many farmers would be a bit upset if I didn't say that really price is obviously what makes a difference day to day and to their business. So we have to bear in mind, what effects are inflation, exchange rates having on price, and therefore can farmers, obviously put food on the table for other people, but also for themselves. Now, all those factors you mentioned, Phil, I think all affect how farmers, farmers get that price and the costs that affect it too. So we also can't take our eye off the day-to-day running of a business too. And of course, beyond that, looking forward, I think there's a lot of uncertainty around those things. So investments, when people think about investing now, what's the confidence like in the industry and on the farm?
It must be, though, reassuring that the Queen's speech and the heavyweights and the trade papers today and so on, they're all sort of picking up on the fact that there are 2 or 3 bills that are in the Queen's speech. There, of course, are a lot of bills that are not in the Queen's speech. So presumably that's reassuring, and if you are pleased about that.
Yeah, and I think people will have seen, our message after that straight away was the agriculture bill itself is obviously a great chance for us to think about the future of policy in agriculture. Now, of course, it's very, very vague at the minute, and it's just simply providing, an effective system to help UK farmers and the natural environment. I think that's key to mention both of those things. Then, of course, the ones around it, customs and immigration. Again, we have asks around what we'd like to see, particularly on a migration system. So it's, I think they're very important. How different they will be from current policy will be obviously what we see later down the line.
To pick up on the point then, Phil, about trade, clearly that's something that's front of mind for a lot of farmers. Just how do you see that panning out?
I know the NFU have been talking very much about having frictionless trade and trying to see trade flows disrupted as little possible. That's logically where I would like to see things happen, because I think there's some practical bits or hurdles that you'd face exporting into the EU. And if you would step outside and speak to a North American business now that is exporting to the UK and to Europe, they face some pretty big challenges in terms of tariffs. I think we're all kind of aware of that, but also around health certification, around border inspection posts, all of which add cost, add delays, add time. And bearing in mind that a lot of our food exports currently go into Europe, I think there's a real risk that if we do see products that were delayed or held up as they leave the UK or as they enter mainland Europe, I think that would be a real threat to us, and I think it would be a deterrent to trade, personally.
Now, we are inviting viewers to direct message us and send us their questions. You can also download information about the Brexit work that AHDB has been doing. If you go to the AHDB website, ahdb.org.uk/Brexit, and all of our information is there. We have been getting some questions in via Twitter, but if you do want to contact us, direct message us at the AHDB, and we'll try and pick up with your questions as the programme goes on. But just for now, Graham, I've got a question that has come in from Rob Hitch. He's saying that if improving productivity is a key objective, do we need new policies that encourage the rationalisation of the use of land and reduce the amount of time that's wasted travelling to off-lying fields? Have you got some comments on that?
Yeah, there's some good questions there. I think there's more than one question, really. Different ideas that Rob's come up with, and I know for sure that sort of DEFRA is already thinking about bringing productivity into the new agricultural policy, whatever it looks like. As Tom says, we don't know the shape of it yet, of course, but it's something that they're considering quite carefully. How efficient, how productive we want to make the entire country is something which I think DEFRA is going to have to sort of challenge and discuss with various different lobby groups as well, because if it were purely efficient, we might find that there would be a compromise in terms of the environmental credentials as well. But yes, efficiency and productivity is important. I mean, there's a mention there with regards to the distance travelling and whether it's too far to travel away from far fields and so on and so forth, which maybe I don't know if he's sort of thinking about the pink diesel and the fact that that's subsidised, but it doesn't have the same duty, does it? So maybe there are questions there. I don't know. I haven't heard anyone talking about it, but it's more than just simply agricultural policy in the long run, and that's the key point I think that's been made in that question.
Yeah. Okay.
And actually, that flags up something really quite interesting. I think is, as much as we talk about the agricultural policy, it's probably the wider policy framework that helps incentivise all businesses,
Absolutely
not
right.
just farms. I think there's a potential there to look at how do we start to incentivise investment more widely, particularly from a rural business aspect. So it's not just all about the farm policy angle.
Sure, that's right. And we've got some specific farming issues in policy out there, and then there are broader ones to do with business efficiency.
I mean, I would agree. Our approach to domestic policies, productivity needs to be a key part of that, along with the environment and volatility mitigation. But as we put together our productivity sort of vision, which we aim to produce fairly soon, we look at wider regulations. So you mentioned investment for, capital allowances and things like that, allowing costs to be written off over time would really help investment in infrastructure. It's not as simple as, okay, we can put a load of money into farming productivity and Bob's your uncle, we're all happy. It's a case of we need to look at peripheral legislation too. So that's definitely the NFU's approach to it as well.
So, but is there a wider issue here around automation? I mean, is technology a solution here that we should be looking at?
It's something which certainly, if to pick up Phil's point with regards to labour, if labour becomes more and more difficult in the future, if there's a greater challenge with regards to profitability because subsidy falls and so on and so forth, and we are going to have to become increasingly efficient to retain the same level of profitability, then this might be a big sort of kick, if you like, to move us on to the next level of productivity, mechanisation. Maybe at some point, if we can't get the labour, our machine's going to have to take over.
From an on-farm point of view, I think, particularly in any sector you talk about, I mean, horticulture was the one rolled out to say, right, we can have automation, we can have mechanisation. I mean, that's a huge investment, and that is probably years off as to what can be attained just by a human hand. And beyond that as well, in the meat processing industry, knife skills are beyond the wit of a machine when it comes to cutting up a carcass. A lot of times, it's a very practical thing, I know, but there's limitations to what you can really do with machinery. So we have to bear in mind that this labour is skilled, and that needs to be recognised as we go forward. And mechanisation is I think something that maybe farmers definitely look at and think about, but it comes with the caveat that there are certain things that are just, as I say, beyond the wit of a machine.
No, I agree.
Yeah, and I think all too often on the labour side, it's categorised as kind of low skill. It's not. It's a specialist skill, and that's what I hear again and again. Whether I'm talking to guys in the red meat sector, whether it's the soft fruit guys, and if you think about some of the the harvesting of picking a raspberry or strawberry, some of the mechanisation involved in that. I think that's pretty difficult. I mean, the other aspect, I think, if you are talking about any sort of mechanisation, it's a considerable investment. If I was making that as a farm business, I'd also want to have some sort of assurances from my customer further down the supply chain about the length of a contract, about possibly the returns and the margins that I could make in terms of that deal.
Can I just say as well, there are a lot of farms that in the sort of the short term or immediately won't necessarily think actually the labour issue is going to bother me because it's me and my son or my father and myself, or a family farm, and might not have issues with regards to migrant labour and so on until, for example, their beef cattle are ready for slaughter and they find actually there's a problem with regards to the number of people working at the local abattoir, or things like that. So it's the whole supply chain that we need to think about rather than just the farm, I believe.
Yeah, and it's things like vets as well. Actually, it's kind of one of the things that's flagged up, particularly around the number of vets from elsewhere in Europe that are involved in things like TB testing on farm.
Official vets, I think it's the FSA, actually they said 85% of their official vets are non-UK origin, and turnover is pretty high too. So there's a need for that to be there, and certainly while the NFU's focus obviously is immediately on farm labour, certainly I think for a lot of sectors labour is the means to add value to their product, whether that be in meat processing or whatever, and also some of the checks and things they have to do. So we have to definitely see it in the round. Yeah.
And 2 years is not a long time. I mean, this is sort of galloping towards us, isn't it? And there are some pretty fundamentals and big decisions to be made. And I just sort of think that earlier this week, government appeared to be a bit reluctant to engage in the debate about the seasonal workers bill, and that's kind of sitting on the back burner. Is that something that you think is going to need to come to the fore to help growers and agriculture?
Well, not necessarily the seasonal agriculture scheme alone. I think we're asking for a suite of measures, certainly. I think that we obviously took that fairly early and got the pushback, well, there's not a labour problem. Well, actually, our most recent survey that came out this week shows no, there is a problem right now in May. Our most recent survey, which covers about 30% of the labour needs, showed that there are 1,500 positions unfilled. And that's now as things stand. What's going to happen down the line is another matter. And businesses need that certainty now. Labour lead-in times are months in advance. You don't just turn up and say, right, I want 900 people to pick blackberries or whatever tomorrow, so blackcurrants tomorrow. It doesn't work like that. And so we need the certainty now from the NFU's point of view over what is there actually going to be. And recognition that there is a problem, because you can lose sight of things in statistics. So that's why we go directly to the farm, ask what's actually going on the ground, and say, look, you can't really shy away from that.
So that's really useful, because that's right here, right now. Earlier on, Phil, we were talking about the fact that investment decisions, planting decisions, animals that are being born this year will be sold in a post-Brexit environment.
Yeah, and I suppose that, again, I think I talked earlier about my own family farm context, the cows that will be calving later on this year. When their calves enter the red meat chain, it'll be in a post-Brexit world. Similarly, I'm conscious that planting decisions that are being made now for crops that will go in the ground in autumn, well, potentially some of that 2018 harvest will be sold after March 2019 and moving on to the marketplace again after we've left the EU. So yeah, we are making decisions now, and we're trying to think about these issues, and I think it's a real challenge to think through the different scenarios because there is so much uncertainty. As I've said before, though, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. There's probably, because there are a lot of scenarios, it's trying to think through those scenarios. But I think, conscious that there are some pretty big question marks right now.
And from an AHDB perspective, we would encourage levy payers and people in the supply chain and so on to engage with us, look at the sort of information that we're generating, but also try and influence what we're doing.
Yeah, definitely keen. And the Horizon reports that we've done to date, so which are focused on some of the big Brexit issues, have hopefully give an ability to make sense of some of those issues, help inform people. Certainly the way that we're heading as well with the most recent one around cereals, we started to also look at some of the opportunities, but also looked perhaps more widely at actually some of the recommendations and some of the things to think about. I mean, the take home for me on a lot of this is, as Graham said actually, it's still about the individual business, and as much as there's uncertainties over what farm support and what trade might look like, actually understanding your own business, being able to understand your own performance, benchmark that, understand where some of the gains are, understand which market you're supplying and what they're rewarding. Those are all kind of pretty good starting points from my perspective.
So Graham, so Phil said opportunities, and that rather flips the story a little bit because we tend to get immersed in the negatives, but actually there's some positives. Is that your experience? Is that what you're hearing out on farm?
Definitely, absolutely. I mean, we've talked about the threats to exporting our goods to the European Union, but actually, if you look at the bulk of commodities in agriculture, most of them we're net importers for. So if we have problems exporting to our marketplace, then the firms and countries exporting to us here in the UK, they might have problems as well. So it could potentially create a barrier for imports. Yes, it may potentially create a smaller, more domestic marketplace, but the prices could be supported in some sectors, depending how the tariffs work out, depending how the tariff rate quotas work out, depending what kind of arrangement we have with Europe in the end. There's lots of dependings, but there could be opportunities there. And of course, whenever the winds of change blow, some people manage to put up, harvest those opportunities.
Every cloud has a silver lining.
There certainly are, and some people will lose out and other people will gain. If subsidy, for example, is reallocated, some people will find there's less and other people will find opportunity to take more from it.
Now on that topic, Tom, we've got another question that's come in on Twitter, so thank you very much for engaging with us on this. James Wright asks, how can Michael Gove promise cheaper food, higher welfare standards and a better deal for farmers in a post-Brexit Britain?
I mean, I heard him say that on the radio too, and I think, I'll just say my eyebrows were raised, and that's probably as far as I go. I think that, it's quite a statement to make. I think you just first need to look at it and say, well, higher standards, welfare standards is a really interesting one because actually we hear lots of people talk about this, but do we know how UK standards compare to other countries? I mean, it's quite anecdotal. Do we know what the regulatory cost burdens will be? So actually there's probably a body of work to do. Well, actually, where are we in terms of standards? It's easy thing to say, but when you get on the farm, I think even if you went to some very very high welfare standard farms, they say, well, what else can I do? In my view, maybe there's more to be done on enforcement. Maybe that's what people really mean when they say about high standards. So that's a slightly different thing. Now, when it comes to so you want cheaper food, let's say you can achieve higher standards. Those two things are often seen at odds. I suppose the first reaction from me is that someone pays for it. Someone pays for that. Okay, so you might have higher standards, you might make it cheaper, but where is that paid for? I mean, we might argue actually at the minute that's paid for through subsidy. Are the retailers going to absorb that? Well, probably not. Let's be honest. Can the farmer absorb any more into his margin? Almost certainly not. And so I guess the answer to that is, well, someone pays. Mr. Gove, who pays? And I think it would struggle to say it will be the farmers that pay for that.
And we I suppose one of the things, there's a couple of things that I think of when I try and think back about maybe examples that we could learn from. One will have been the welfare ban that we had on, that was introduced on pork and pig production. We introduced it in the UK more than a decade in advance of other parts in the EU. The assumption was, or the insistence was don't worry, British consumers will buy higher welfare pork, the retailers will support that. Actually price won out at the end of the day, so in effect what we lost was a portion of our pork sector. The other thing that is probably certainly relatively fresh in farmers' minds is what happened with horse meat in the food supply chain. Is that a consequence that certainly farmers will start to point to of going around the world looking for cheap food options? So your point, Tom, about kind of everything comes at a cost, I think is one that needs to be borne in mind. I think there's some really interesting points as well that you make around the animal welfare, around actually just taking stock of where we are and how that measures up.
Just continuing that theme, we've been contacted by Andrew Skier, and Andrew says that we hear about Brexit opportunities. Are there any examples of markets that could be made more accessible? Anybody got a view on that?
I suppose one that comes to mind just from sort of informed conversation with livestock teams is maybe there's high value markets for British beef, let's say, or lamb in places like the US. Obviously there is no free trade agreement. Obviously that was sort of scuppered fairly recently in the EU. Potentially there's a market there maybe on the east coast, some of the more affluent areas in the US for that premium product. We actually already see Scotland Food and Drink doing quite a good job of, obviously have done it very well with whiskey, the Whisky Association, but now getting beef into China and some of the high-end markets there. So I would say that they are, but of course that needs to be balanced. Well, what are we accepting back the other way?
Indeed. I wonder whether we might just. There will be new markets become available, no doubt. As you say, I wonder as well whether we should spend a bit of time just thinking about making sure we meet our own home needs as well. We import quite a lot of the food we eat in this country, which means there's plenty of opportunity to do something better to feed ourselves. Now, I'm not the sort of person that says we need to be self-sufficient by any means, and the market will out. But going back to the previous conversation about being the best in the world, is it higher welfare, is it more efficient farmers, is it lower cost? Well, it's almost describing a separation of two different ends of the marketplace, isn't it? Low cost, high welfare. And therefore, different people have different requirements from the marketplace. Here in the UK, we still have an opportunity to meet their needs better.
I think there's some interesting things to look at from a trading angle as well. And you mentioned whiskey there, Tom. I think that's exactly right. We need to be looking at how do we get a greater share or more of a shift towards those added value, probably more highly processed products, so that the jobs in the manufacturing are in the UK. And we're sending out finished goods in containers rather than bulk agricultural commodities in boats. Yeah, sure. And that way we get more of the economic growth staying here in the UK. And I think some of the areas where we look around the world, China is the obvious one that springs to mind, but I think more widely some of the Asia Pacific markets, just because of the sheer population growth that is happening in that part of the world, and also the income growth, that starts to change some of the behaviours in the market potential.
And certainly that would tend to suggest that farming methods are going to have to change, and some farmers are going to have to make some pretty big decisions. I'm wondering how they access that, and how do they reassure themselves. So I know that through the Horizon documents, Phil, AHDB have been sort of looking at certain scenarios and so on, and that information is obviously available on the website. But presumably, people are looking to actually talk through, what does this all mean on my farm? This is some big issue stuff. Is that something where that you're getting a lot of contact and interaction over, Graham?
Yes, I mean we are, and sort of fundamentally we need to remind ourselves that whatever happens post Brexit, some people might be better off, some people might be worse off, and we are preparing for farmers being worse off than they are now. Except we don't precisely know who, of course, but we need to bear in mind just how resilient the farming industry is. AHDB, we've done some work on that in recent years, and they are a very, very robust, or it is a very robust sector, and will be able to cope. The industry will. There will be personal tragedies if there are shifts in, how money is shifted around, but as an industry, we will be here and we will be strong in 5, 10, 20 years' time. And so, as we mentioned at the beginning, there's been a Brexit boost. The prices of output, agricultural output, has gone up. So the sensible thing to do with that money is look after it, pay off debt, put it in the bank, make yourself even more robust and strong, because really we don't actually know what's going to happen in 2 years' time. But be prepared, be braced for, A, if profitability does go down, and B, the opportunities when they arise are best captured when you're in a strong position.
And that's something I think about, is looking at the scenarios and being ready for them. I suppose one of the things that we did some work earlier this year, asking levy payers about Brexit and good thing or bad thing essentially. We had a chunk of people that said, yeah, it's going to be positive for my business. A chunk of people said, no, it's going to be really bad. A chunk of people that said, I really don't know. And 25% of people that were saying it's probably going to mean no change. Well, some of those people, they can't all be right in terms of their take on Brexit. And I suppose one of the things that I'd probably worry about is maybe some people are going, well, actually things won't change that much, because actually we could be looking at some major changes for the industry, and at least try and think through the scenarios. What are the extremes? What might you do in those extremes?
That's right.
And so that scenario thinking, that's being sort of written up and documented in these Horizon documents, which people can access on the AHDB website.
Yeah.
But also, I'm sure we're all out there talking to farmers, and but this is a two-way street, isn't it? So we're trying to talk to them, but we need them to talk to us as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's very true. I mean, obviously the NFU, we did that last year when we went round, firstly before the referendum, and obviously did roadshows there to outline some, what the facts. And then after that to try and garner what was the industry thinking, where do we maybe want to go in terms of in terms of policy. And we heard loud and clear that farmers want the industry to be better, they want to be better businesses, but you mentioned, Graham, about personal tragedies. Obviously the NFU, we want to see as few of them as possible.
Of course.
And I would say one of the best things to help alleviate that would be farmers think about the businesses, but also go out and make a case for farming to the public, to politicians. And obviously that's the NFU's job, but equally I think farmers are ambassadors in their daily activities for what they do, to engage and say, look, this is what I'm doing, this is why it matters. And so you can actually get to a point where people think, well, no, I will buy British food, or no, actually domestic policy seems like a good idea, because if we have that support, then of course we can hopefully avoid as much of that pain in the transition as possible.
I guess that's something that I'm conscious the NFU have really captured and continue to drive, and I suppose whether trying to make sure that there's public understanding of their food and where it comes from, of maybe some of the issues. I guess some of the challenges we've seen in the dairy sector around price, that's been headline news and has triggered a certain amount of understanding amongst shoppers, and I suppose I suppose it's trying to get that message across, because at the end of the day we've got 65 million shoppers here in the UK. If they were more actively asking the question about food and where it comes from, that could be a positive. I was going to jump back to actually a point that we talked about, Michael Gove and cheap food. One of the kind of a personal bugbear actually is when we do start talking about food being much more expensive. Well, actually, because of deflation we've seen in the food industry and food prices over the last 3 years, the basket of goods, yes, we are seeing inflation increase right now, still cheaper than it was 3 or 4 years ago. We're still spending less than 10% of our income on food. It is relatively cheap if we start looking at it in the broader context.
We've got a question that comes in that sort of plays into that, so that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Andrew Knowles asks us, how do we square the circle of high welfare, protecting the environment and sustainability, which all increase costs of livestock production, and also about increasing the competitiveness of our products in the global market? How do we square all that together? Anybody got a view?
Well, I guess it goes back to what we said, it has to be paid for. I mean, you mentioned things about, welfare and environment there. The market doesn't really pay for those at the minute. So maybe there's a job of work to be done to make the market pay for that more equally, maybe through a better, maybe assurance schemes and things like that. Getting that recognised in the price would be one way of doing it. And equally, when you have that quality and when you have that assurance in the chain, well, you can easier take that abroad, with an amount of confidence. To an extent, we see Ireland doing it, with their beef and their board there, and their dairy products too. They get it right at home. and then they sell that abroad. Now, of course, there are things to improve in their system, obviously, and we'd like to do that here. But I think it is possible. But again, it comes down to paying for it, and it's the market or it's policy. So it's a cost somewhere, or you lose out on one of those sort of things you're trying to achieve.
Final thought from you, Greg?
Well, I was just going to say that comes back to the division between sort of the high standard, low price sort of thing, doesn't it? But the low cost still needs to have its minimum standards, as you say. So, DEFRA is going to have an opportunity to build more of those sorts of things into its compliance legislation if it decides to do that in years to come. So, maybe that's something we'll see happen.
Anything you want to add, Phil?
No, I think we started talking off about some of the challenges, and it's very easy to go down the track where you think, oh geez, there are all these things that are really quite difficult, but let's remember there are the positives as well. And from an individual business perspective, I think it's just being aware of some of the challenges that are coming, but also trying to think about, right, how do I prepare for some of this, and how do I make sure I've got my heads up, my business is in the right place for taking advantage of the opportunities.
Great. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. That was a really valuable debate. Well, look, I think from what you've just heard, we all really do believe that there are opportunities, there are some issues that have got to be overcome, but farming certainly does matter in this world. I've got a few thank yous. I'd like to thank you for sending in your questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we will come back and answer them in due course. You can download all the information that AHDB has produced around Brexit. You can go to the AHDB website, ahdb.org.uk/Brexit. So please get the information from there. I'd like to thank the crew. This wouldn't have been done without them. My producer, Joe Crowley. Thanks for watching.